think that, and then on this forest, it's usually no old trees and no greater than 21 dBH unless it's for restoration purposes and you really need that log. So in the upland units, or upland area where the riparian, it's still the RHCA, what would it make you feel better if there's no new roads, if you're operating on a slash mat to move that material around? Does that help you understand the sediment contribution, or is it just the idea that it's not a research project where you're monitoring, because we're monitoring in a different area and it's pretty intensive monitoring and we're not doing it over, you know, a year or two because you're not going to see impacts like that. Or is it just like the changing of buffers that really is the...
No, it's not the changing of buffers, it's the proximity to surface waters. That's the scientific concern from a scientific point of view. But the concern that you're asking about specifically related to that is the certainty associated with various practices. There is no way to establish the certainty of practices without a fairly large amount of research, experimental application of those practices, and sound reporting of the results. So I know the Forest Service does do a lot of monitoring, and very little of it ever either gets finished or sees the light of day in print. So that's a missed opportunity that certainly I think we could all probably agree on.
Yeah, sure, under research.
Okay, never mind.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks. Yeah.
Large fires in these forest types in the western United States, including the largest, are still predominantly low and moderate intensity. A lot of people don't realize that. This is the rim fire. I spent a lot of time in there. I've got a few different research projects going on in the rim fire. Green is low, yellow, moderate, red, high. There's some significant high intensity fire patches, definitely, but mostly the fire is low and moderate. And even within these red polygons, there are a lot of individual large surviving trees, much more heterogeneous than most people realize. I take people into the fire area often and do site visits, and oftentimes we're driving along for a while and they ask me when we're going to get to the rim fire, and I tell them we've been in the rim fire for the last 20 minutes as we're driving. Can you tell from
that map if there's any riparian areas in there?
Well, I can tell you, like, this is a riparian area here, for example. Riparian area goes through here, some burned low and moderate, some burned hot, and I'll be talking about that a little bit too.
So the one you first pointed out, that was a high intensity burn.
Well, this right through here is the riparian zone. This actually burned low and moderate mostly, little bits of high intensity in here. There's a riparian area right through here that burned in a mix of low, moderate, and high. This is riparian area right there. So I mean, it's definitely a mix. Just like the fire area, on balance, the riparian areas tended to burn a little bit lower intensity than the rest of the forest, which is pretty common in a lot of regions. This is the wall of fire, central eastern Arizona in 2011, 564,000 acres. Again, mostly low moderate. These definitions of high intensity fire, most people call it high severity fire. I don't like the term severity. I think it's got a pejorative connotation, so I always try to use value neutral terms. Intensity is technically the energy release from a fire, but it tends to correlate very strongly with severity, which is the vegetation mortality. Definitions always vary, depends on where you set your threshold. So if you define high severity very broadly, you would get more red. But bottom line is, no matter what, you're still getting mostly low moderate. Okay, now so a couple other things. This is also surprising to most folks. We have less fire now of all intensities in western conifer forests, nearly every region, than we had historically before fire suppression. There are a small number of places where it's within the range, including where I live, in the San Bernardino Mountains in Southern California. And this is based on a number of different studies looking at this from a number of different, using a number of different methods. In the Blue Mountains in particular, Baker 2015 looked at this, and the current high intensity fire rotation interval is about 1,400 years. This is several hundred years longer than historical, meaning less high intensity fire. So that may be surprising to folks. Obviously, that's just high intensity. There's low and moderate as well. But the rotation interval for high intensity fire in particular at the landscape scale is much less frequent than people realize. Another thing that's going to sound counterintuitive. This is pretty hot off the press research. Kaiser and Westerling, they looked at different regions all across the western United States. They looked at the trend of high-intensity fire since 1984, which is when first year we had satellite imagery we can use to look at high-intensity fire in particular. They found no increasing trend of high-intensity fire except possibly Colorado. But interestingly, they did not find an increase even in the bigger fires. So in other words, as fire size goes up, you don't get more intense fires, you just get more fire. They thought that was an interesting finding. And this is occurring even as temperature and is going up, and even as fire season is lengthening due to climate change. So interestingly, though we are getting more fire, mostly that big increase occurred from the 70s to the 80s. We had a shift from cool to warm phase Pacific decadal oscillation, multi-decadal climate shift that has a big influence on fire. We had a big jump from the 70s to the 80s. We've had incremental increases in overall fire since then, but not high intensity fire in particular, which is interesting. This is research from Bill Baker, published earlier this year, looking at frequency of low severity fire historically in dry ponderosa pine and mixed conifer forests. And I apologize, I had a legend there explaining these dots. So basically the red dots are less than 25 years. The yellow dots are 25 to 40 years, and the green is 40 to 55 years. Now, a little bit of explanation of why this is different from what you hear most of the time, because there are lots of studies out there, and good studies, good work, about fire return interval. And the one difference is that is not spatially explicit. It doesn't necessarily include all of the area within the boundaries of the polygons that are studied. It doesn't include, in other words, you can have very small lightning spot fires that don't burn the whole area. So it tends to overestimate the amount of fire that occurred and therefore overestimate the frequency. Dr. Baker used correction factors, looked at the whole suite of methods, and determined that a lot of these forest types have actual rotation intervals. In other words, how often a given patch of ground, a given acre, let's say, actually burn is longer than most people realize. That's important because it explains a lot of the mixed intensity fire effects we're seeing from other methods.
Super
and
quick
historical.
question on your data, how do you have these bullseye things? What do those mean? Because you can't have
those are
5, 10, 15, and 20.
those are study sites that are very close together.
Okay.
I don't think they're exactly overlapping, but
Okay.
yeah. And the blue is even longer, but those were less common. But point is that in actual fire frequency, a little bit less frequent than most people realize, and certainly variable. And there were areas that did burn at those frequencies, but they weren't. It wasn't consistently that way. It was more variable. Forest density, historical forest density. This was from Williams and Baker, 2012. This is Blue Mountains. About half of the forest had tree densities over 70 per acre in trees over 4 inches in diameter. So that doesn't include those trees under 4 inches in diameter. And of course, many were much higher than that. And at the same time, you had a very open forest with very low density. Point is, you had a mix. You had a lot of variability. It wasn't a cookie cutter. It wasn't a one-size-fits-all. And I think, again, this reflects a dynamic mixed intensity fire regime that was occurring that was certainly more significant before fire suppression. And this reflects that. So this is fire intensity, low, moderate, and high, the high being the red. A significant mix, 17% overall, actually 16.5, I rounded up, but high intensity was just about 17%. And some of the patches were small, some of them were medium, some of them were quite large. There were patches hundreds or even thousands of acres in size. Those obviously were less frequent, but they did occur.
Were those years? Was there a timeline for that 17%?
Yeah, it was over the entire study period, which was multiple decades. I'd have to look back and tell you the exact years that bracketed that study. And if you send me an email, I'll send you the study and I'll give you the years. But it was, most of his work on this, it's typically around a century, a little bit less or a little bit more. So I'd have to go back to that paper and give you the exact years. And that's really important to know. And so whether it happens in 10 years or whether it happens in 100 years makes a big difference. So these are quotes. I'm sorry, this is a little bit hard to see, but these are quotes from the journals of John C. Fremont and his 1845 expedition through the Blue Mountains, John C. Fremont, Kit Carson. And there are a lot of quotes like this. I know I'm violating a basic rule of PowerPoint etiquette by putting way too much text on a slide. I apologize for that. I made an exception here. I think this is pretty important. So I just want to leave this up and just let you read some of these. You know, descending a bad ravine into which we drove our animals and had much trouble with them in a very close growth of small pine. The trail passed sometimes through very thick young timber in which there was much cutting to be done, but after traveling a few miles, the mountains became more bald. After cutting through 2 thick bodies of timber, the forest became more open. The pines here were 11 or 12 feet in circumference. On and on. Bottom line is that this is, again, consistent with very heterogeneous dynamic processes. Highly variable stand structure, highly variable age structure, highly variable fire intensity. So you've got areas that are dense and young, regenerating from past natural disturbance. This is before these areas had been generally pre-settlement. And then you've got areas that are very open forests dominated by very large trees. You had that mix. It wasn't only one or the other.
So what you're suggesting is some places, like specific places in the landscape, aren't always that high severity, like that 17%. Is that like batched across the landscape, or does that tend to occur within certain process domains, or like spatial domains on the landscape?
That's a really good question. It is not in, if it's in a particular areas where it continues to always occur, I've not seen that research. Everything that I've seen indicates that it is across the landscape in space and time in any given century, let's say, in any large landscape. But it's not going to necessarily be in the same spot. Now, you do have areas where it does happen twice in a century, or twice in 2 centuries, or even twice in 30 years. That happens. It's rarer. But generally speaking, it's a matter of natural succession. It's a matter of when that particular stand is at a particular stage and happens to come across an area during high fire weather that burns hot, because weather tends to dominate fire effects in high fire weather, not structure. Overwhelmed structure is an explanatory factor in fire intensity. And so it's really going to be driven by that, these very, very, at least seemingly random factors across the landscape that intersect with natural succession in time and space, but not particular areas.
Try to hold questions till the end, if possible, unless
It's directly related to this.
Well, I know, but what I mean is, unless it's directly related to interpreting a slide, it'd be easier for him if we did the same as we did with.
I can do it either way. I promise I will answer your question. I like questions. I like the Q&A better than the presentation, actually. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the biodiversity aspects, because this is something I focus a lot on. I do fire history research, but I also focus a lot on wildlife species that are associated with post-fire habitat. To me, I need to understand that to understand the fire history properly, because they have evolutionary biology implications. This is a low-intensity fire area. It's very low intensity. This is the Star Fire of 2001. It's the western slope of the Sierra Nevada. It looks unburned. It really wasn't changed much. The fire just crept along. There's very little concern about this type of fire. Early 20th century, even this freaked people out. But at this point in time, there's widespread acceptance about this. So we are moving along. There is acceptance also, I think, about mixed intensity fire effects, more than just low intensity. But I think that that acceptance is fairly narrow. Moderate intensity patches, sure, smaller high intensity fire patches. So I want to talk about what the things that are more misunderstood for people, which is this. This is snag forest habitat. This is created by patches of high intensity fire. This is a large high intensity fire patch, same fire, but I took this picture at 12 years post-fire. So this is after 12 years of natural succession, no cutting, no planting, no herbicide spraying. And this is a productive area. So in some areas, such as southwestern forests and some of these forests in the drier sites, you're not going to get that much growth in 12 years. It's going to take a little bit longer. The successional trajectory may be a little bit different. Even in fact, the next site over was a little bit different than this. So there's a lot of variability. But the point is that the concept that these areas are these barren wastelands with a bed of ash and these fire-charred trees. That is a concept that is a function of how these things are covered in the media and how we pay attention to them as a society. Almost all the coverage is when the fires are burning and right after they're out. And I went into this area just after the fire was out multiple times. It did look bleak. It did look barren. That's what they look like, afterwards. There was a bed of ash and just these black trees. A lot of people think that that's the way it stays if you don't do something about it, if you don't cut it and manage it and plant it. But in the first spring after the fire, it starts to change. You get the wildflowers, and you get the shrubs, and you get the oaks and the dogwoods, and you get the conifer regeneration. And the woodpeckers come in because they're eating the wood-boring beetle larvae and the shrub nesting species. And that process accelerates and picks up with every successive year after fire. And it turns out that this habitat, in its many forms, this snag forest habitat, is comparable to old-growth forest in terms of native biodiversity and wildlife abundance. And I know that's counterintuitive for a lot of folks. It sounds really bizarre given all we hear about catastrophic wildfire. But the fact is, this is backed up by now hundreds of scientific studies. We summarized many of them in the book that we came out with 2 years ago, The Ecological Importance of Mixed Severity Fires, Nature's Phoenix. And there's no question about that now. This is tremendously important wildlife habitat from any biodiversity standpoint. So one of the species I study is the blackback woodpecker. I started wondering about this species because you find it in forests that historically were thought to be homogeneously open and park-like with just about nothing but low-intensity fire historically. We have a much more nuanced idea about fire regimes and forest structure in these forest types now. And they do live in upper montane and boreal forests, certainly, but they also live in mixed conifer forests, quite a lot, actually, as long as they've got good habitat. Can anyone see the blackback woodpecker in the picture? Anyone want to make a guess? No cheaters if you've seen my presentation before.
Yeah, well, it's not that,
All right, so I was standing 30 feet from her. It's a female blackback woodpecker, that's her head and tail. I was standing 30 feet from her when I took this picture. If they don't vocalize, if they don't move, they're essentially invisible. They have perfect natural camouflage. And what they're doing is they're eating the larvae of native wood-boring beetles, which depend on fire-killed trees. The woodpeckers create nest cavities in fire-killed trees because they're a little softer than live trees, and because that's where the food is. One blackback woodpecker eats 13,500 wood-boring beetle larvae every single year. Just for itself, so you need a lot of fire-killed trees to have enough food for the woodpeckers and their young to survive and reproduce. And they're monogamous. The male creates 2 to 4 nest cavities every spring. The female picks the one she likes the best, and that's what they use. So all the ones that he created that she didn't pick are available for all the other cavity nesting species in the forest to use, species that can't create their own cavities but need them to survive. You're talking about mountain bluebirds and western bluebirds, obviously, it's more well known. Chickadees, nuthatches, wrens, flying squirrels even, and even pine martens have been found using former blackback woodpecker nest cavities. So they are what we call a keystone species because their importance in the ecosystem is disproportionately high. But again, none of this is possible without the natural disturbance processes that kill the trees, attract these native wood-boring beetles, give the woodpeckers the food and the dead trees to excavate and create then the homes for all the other cavity nesting species. But it's not just the woodpeckers, it's also what happens in the understory. When you have patches of high-intensity fire, it spurs the germination of a lot of fire-following plants, flowering plants, not just shrubs, but also wildflowers. That attracts huge diversity and abundance of flying insects, native flying insects, and that provides food for birds and fly-catching birds and bats. It also provides habitat, the shrubs, the down logs, the snags, for small mammals. And that can be really important for a lot of raptor species. So you have a very rich and interconnected ecosystem that is incredibly biodiverse, much more so than folks realize. Now, I did this study in 2014. I looked at bird species that are associated with snag forest habitat created by high-intensity fire versus those that are associated with unburned forest or forest burned at low intensity. And I looked at their population trajectory, the population decline. What proportion of these species are declining? And I was shocked at the results. A much higher proportion, statistically significant, as you can probably tell from this large difference, a much higher proportion of the ones that are associated with and depend on snag forest habitat are declining. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not concerned about the percent that are declining in forests that birds that are associated with low intensity or unburned forests. Definitely concerned about those as well. But the point is that there's a conservation biology issue here that we really need to pay attention to, because when you have over 40% of the species that depend on a particular habitat type that are in trouble, it's something we really need to pay attention to. Now, apologies, because I'm delving a little bit more into Chris's field, and he can certainly talk more about the details of this than I can. But I wanted to touch on it briefly, because I think it's fascinating. Some researchers, Mallison and Baxter and Mallison, they've done a number of different studies on this. They looked at forests that burn at varying levels of fire intensity, including high intensity, and did a really cool paper where they looked at this trophic cascades issue. What does it do to the aquatic insect populations, and therefore, as they emerge from the stream as adults, bat populations, providing food for the bats. They found in the high intensity, the riparian forests that burned at high intensity, and these are unlogged, and 5 to 10 years post-fire, so there's some years of natural succession, that the highest levels were in the areas of high intensity. And so this was actually for riparian and aquatic ecosystems, this was actually a benefit, not a detriment. As researchers look at this more and more, what they're tending to find is there is typically, not always, typically a short-term dip in the first year or two after fire in native fish populations. For a while, a lot of the studies just looked at 1 or 2 years post-fire, and so it was assumed that fire, especially high-intensity fire, is categorically bad for native fish, because they'd see that dip. But you have to follow it for a little bit longer, and what you see is it comes up to levels comparable to or above pre-fire levels by about 3 years post-fire. And that is, interestingly, especially true where there are significant debris flows, that pulse of sedimentation, contrary to the chronic sedimentation that happens year after year after year for many years from logging roads and landings and skid trails like Chris was talking about. This is a pulse of sedimentation which typically happens mostly in the first winter after a fire. And it doesn't happen in all places to any significant degree, but can be very significant. And it turns out, at least by 3 years or more post-fire, the native fish tend to do quite well. In this study, the non-native brook trout did not increase, but the natives did. I'm going to talk a little bit about something that really isn't discussed much in terms of thinning for fuel reduction and reduction of fire severity. This is a study by Stevens et al. Done in 2009. This is 90th percentile fire weather from the Blue Mountains. I'm sorry, this is the wrong slide. Apologies. Okay, I'm sorry, that last one was from they had several different regions. That one was from the Sierra Nevada. I'm going to go back to it because it actually is fairly similar from the Blue Mountains. No, that's actually not the right one. Apologies for that, folks. I don't know how that got messed up. What the slide does show, the right one, is that you've got lower levels of tree mortality in these smallest size classes. This is basically 1 to 10 inches, this is 10 to 20 inches, 20 to 30, and 30 plus inches. So this is nothing, this is control, this is thinning only, and this is thinning plus fall burning. And then you've got prescribed fire as well. Bottom line is that you have somewhat lower to substantially lower levels of tree mortality in wildland fire and high fire weather in the thinned areas, especially if they've been burned afterwards. In the smaller size classes, not much difference in the larger size classes. But one thing that's left out of every study that I've ever read about this issue is the mortality caused by thinning itself. And to me, if we're going to have a conversation that's based upon tree mortality, and that's going to be a metric that people are paying attention to, you have to focus on the tree mortality caused by thinning. I made these calculations based upon the data, putting a couple different data sources together in the study. But bottom line is that ultimately, the cumulative effect is you're killing more trees in the combined thinning plus wildland fire than wildland fire alone.
Wait a sec, can you say that again? I just
Yeah.
want to make sure I really get that, because I don't think I've seen this data before.
Yeah, no, you have. I just put this together. This is
Okay.
this is data. This is data that was not presented in the study. This is data that was from a table that showed basically the level of trees removed, and then a table that showed the level of trees killed in wildland fire after removal. What I'm saying is that if you take the pre-removal stands and you look at the whole level of mortality from logging itself and then what's left from fire, you get a very different picture than what you get just looking at the tree mortality projections after thinning and burns. Let me take an extreme example just to illustrate the point. This is not what they did, but the level of removal is pretty significant. Imagine you removed 99% of the trees in the stand. Again, not what they did here. They removed a lot, but not nearly that many. But imagine you did. You removed 98%, let's say. You left 3 trees, big trees. They're all 30 inches in diameter, let's say. Everything else is gone. That's all you've got, 3 trees per acre, okay? And then you say, okay, let's run the modeling, 90th percentile fire weather. Fire comes through and you say, wow, we did great. Look how effective thinning was. We had 0% tree mortality. Okay, so I mean, that's an extreme example, but it illustrates the point. That's kind of what I'm getting at here, is that if we're going to talk about that, we really need to be honest and do a full accounting of it. The other thing I would mention is that qualitatively, from an ecological standpoint, there's no comparison between the snags and down logs you get from natural disturbance processes, which are critically important for wildlife, versus stumps that are left from thinning. So even the tree mortality is not fully accounting for it, because a dead tree that's not thinned is a vital contribution to the ecosystem. This is the rim fire at 4 years post-fire. I just took this picture just a couple months ago. You see this natural regeneration of shrubs and conifers of different species and the standing snags. This is just 4 years post-fire. Again, very productive site, but still, I took this picture in the same area of the fire area with high intensity fire that was logged. This was logged almost 3 years ago. I took this picture just a few weeks ago. So this is what it looks like at almost 3 years after the post-fire logging. This was called restoration and fuel reduction. There is mostly bare ground and cheatgrass now, and some slash debris. What they planted has almost entirely died. They also killed almost all the natural conifer regeneration that was there before they logged. This is just a cautionary note about what management practices I think we lead to if we don't understand the ecological value of these natural disturbance processes, including patches of high intensity fire that create snag forest habitat. Obviously that was not valued here. Another example. This is very, very common. So what does it all mean? Bottom line, very simplistic, but overall I think what the research is telling us is wildland fires do not destroy forests. It is possible to have too much of a good thing. We are not in that circumstance. I think the circumstance we're in is too little of a good thing. So I don't think we need to be afraid of fire destroying our forests. They do naturally regenerate. Some forests take longer, some do it faster, depending on how productive they are and how much precipitation. Weakening environmental laws and increasing logging is not the answer. It's not a solution. And I think, bottom line, we need to move away from backcountry fire suppression and logging and redirect resources into communities, protecting homes from fire, defensible space work, helping people make their homes more fire safe, and developing evacuation plans for people and their animals. This is a critical thing. We've seen the tragedy that results from not paying attention to that time and time again. In my view, every dollar spent trying to stop a weather-driven backcountry fire that can't be stopped practically and shouldn't be stopped ecologically is a dollar that's not spent protecting communities. And thank you. And I'd be happy to answer questions.
James?
Well, I find myself in complete agreement with everything you said. I do. We do have a fire deficit when you consider the scale of the West. High severity post-fire environments are, in many cases, high-quality habitat for many species. John Charles, Vermont did have to cut through some heavy timber. Thinning does kill trees. And Bill Baker does say that, you know, we used to have a lot more high-severity fire than most other scientists would acknowledge. I think we'd all mostly agree with all of that, and I'm not sure that any of it really implicates the landscape scale restoration that the Malheur National Forest has undertaken. We're not saying that we're not saying there's going to be less high-severity fire. We're going to have more high-severity fire, not less high-severity fire. We're not saying that thinning doesn't kill trees. That is the point, after all. There's going to be plenty of habitat. There is plenty of habitat for blackback woodpeckers today and will be tomorrow. More, not less, more. I think the only thing that really gravitates, that you've shown us here that gravitates against what we're trying to do is Bill Baker's work. Bill would say, you know, you don't have to thin because there was always lots and lots of high severity fire. But the problem again is the Forest Service has to use the best available scientific information. That's a legal requirement. And I think you know that Bill Baker is not the best available science.
I disagree with that strongly. We can talk about that.
Well, let me finish.
Yeah.
You know, there's a half dozen peer-reviewed articles about the Blue Mountains, about historical successional disturbance dynamics of the Blue Mountains that would directly contradict Bill. And the fact is, as you well know, that most scientists, and I'm talking like 99 out of 100 ecologists,